So we're recording. Thank you for the lovely welcome, Sister Angelina. I always feel at home when I come with the sisters here. And I'm sorry that a certain little disease has kept us from joining with the greater communities. But thank God technology does come to our aid. If there are any... It's working? So just as the words left my lips about technology not failing us, I'm just getting a question mark. Can you all hear me well? Those joining us through Zoom? Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Then let's begin with a short prayer and we'll get straight into it. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us here together in your name to think about, to contemplate the teachings our Holy Father has given us in the encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, what St. Francis of Assisi said to his brothers. You're all brothers. And which was written recently on the 3rd of October 2020. Give us the light, O Lord, to understand the teaching there, to see it in light of the gospel of Jesus, how Jesus would have us act, to be brothers and sisters to one another in our own age, in the greater community of our society and across the world. Heavenly Mother, you who watch over your children with great attention and care, keep your eyes on us now, keep us faithful in your Son. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Francis of Assisi,
pray for us.
And St. Paul the Shut,
pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So, as I mentioned, the letter was written by the Pope Francis on the 3rd of October last year, which is the vigil for the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, which is on the 4th of October. And in fact, he signed the letter significantly on the tomb of St. Francis in Assisi. So it was a very special moment for the Pope. Obviously, he took his name from that, from the great saint there of the 12th or 13th century. If I could say this, you're not going to hear anything that you haven't already heard or known as part of Catholic teaching. And the Pope doesn't set out to, I've got, several pages of notes, but the Pope is not setting out to kind of tell us anything that we more or less didn't know. But if I could say it in a simple nutshell, that Fratelli Tutti is about the principle of love of your neighbor, but taken across every conceivable level. So not only in a one-to-one sense, but across families, across society, across countries, ultimately to reach the world. So the first thing is that it's very idealistic, and it's really hoping for the big picture. We know that in reality, many of these things unfortunately won't be put into practice, but unless someone like the Pope is saying them, then a lot of world governments, a lot of people who can in fact put things into practice wouldn't otherwise hear them. And just as, for instance, St. John Paul II, when the lead up to the Great Jubilee in 2000, was calling for a cancellation of debts for various countries. You might remember those of you at that time who were focusing on these issues, and you remember actually some countries did choose to cancel their debts that they had with poorer countries. So, and he was using the idea of the Great Jubilee, that every 50 years the Jewish people would, rest the land, they would hand any land that they've taken over from others back to the original owners, and so forth. So I think Pope Francis is actually trying to do something similar here. The other, if you want a little optic or a lens through which he keeps coming again and again and again, is the whole creating a culture of encounter. And he mentions this in a lot of different ways. I'll point it out to you as we get to it and as we keep on seeing it. But if we have this openness to encounter the other, then while notwithstanding the necessities of peace and justice, of truth, and he goes into these in great detail, ultimately it's, am I committed to go out to my neighbor, even though it might make me uncomfortable, to resolve the differences that we have? And if the answer is yes, and I'm a believer, then I'm a faithful believer and faithful disciple of Christ. If the answer is yes, and I'm not a believer, then I am a person of goodwill. At the end of the day, believers or non-believers, it's those who are of goodwill that God will use and to transform his world. And it's interesting in the parable of the Last Judgment that Jesus, when he comes again in glory, he doesn't, according to the parable, won't be asking, now did you go to church on Sundays? Did you say your prayers every day? Did you keep the 10 Commandments? None of these questions are asked. It's all, I was hungry and he gave me food, I was thirsty, he gave me to drink, and so forth. So, of course, he's not saying that the other commandments are not important, but he's saying that this practical charity is essentially what living as good human children of God is all about. So I'm just going to point out all the numbers I've got here are the paragraphs in the letter. So it's 92 pages, 74 pages of text, and the rest is footnotes. And so in paragraph 3, he starts off without borders. And you know, what he means is that he's talking about a little example with St. Francis of Assisi, when he sent out St. Francis of Assisi actually joined the First Crusade. He didn't join it with swords to go and fight or anything like that, but he wanted to go and convert the Muslim people to true faith in Christ. And in this age where there's so much political correctness, you know, that we can't say anything that will offend anybody and all of that, it can sound odd, St. Francis's example, but in fact he went to meet the great Sultan, and St. Francis went in his humility, and the Sultan was very, very impressed by what he saw of St. Francis and his brothers. But knowing, of course, that the necessity to go and make disciples of all nations and baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, he tells his brothers, he says, if you find yourself among the Saracens, and the Saracens is simply another word, or it's a type of Muslims, you know, from different parts of the world. But if you find yourself among the Saracens and other non-believers, without renouncing your identity, so without renouncing your faith, he says to them, don't engage in arguments or disputes. He says, just be humble and submissive to them, and this in itself will speak volumes. Now, what is the Pope saying here when he means without borders? Because he's saying that if charity, if real love for our brothers and sisters is going to convert the world, it's got to extend beyond the boundaries of our own families and of our own faith. We must be willing to go out to those of other faiths. But how do we engage in evangelization? For some, and in some situations, it will require a real talking. It will require a discussion about our faith. St. Peter, in one of his letters, I think it's his first letter, says, always have ready within you the reason for the hope that you have within you. In other words, when someone asks you, why do you believe these things? Why is it that you have so much joy? Why is it that the troubles of the world don't seem to weigh you down? Well, because of my life in Christ. We need to be ready with the answers to help people who ask us. But before we start doing that, very often it's our example that's going to speak very loudly. Which doesn't mean it's only example, but our example has to be there, and profoundly so. And so he instructs his brothers, many of whom could explain the faith very, very well, to not enter into arguments or disputes, because it might just be an off-putting thing. Paragraph 5, then he talks about human fraternity and social friendship as being something very near and dear to Pope Francis's heart. ever since, you might remember when he first became Pope, people started talking about this thing called the Francis effect. And what they meant by that is that he was having an effect of his genuineness, his sincerity as he spoke to people. At that time I was still completing my studies in Rome, and different priests and bishops who had met him said to me, it was just a really good experience. They said it was so friendly. It's as if I was the only focus for him in the world. He really gave me that attention, and I'm sure that's got something to do with just his deep care and interest in social friendship and fraternity, that you're actually present to somebody. So much so that at various moments throughout the letter, he talks about how to engage in these sorts of relationships, because it seems that at least some, perhaps many, Christians or non-Christians have lost a sense, or have never had it, how to engage another person. So, but anyway, we'll get to those as we go along. In paragraph 9, though, he starts off, so it's very early on, and he says there are dark clouds over a closed world and shattered dreams. And he starts to lament what's going on around the world. He said this a number of times before, but that effectively there's like a third world war going on. But it's just not all united, it's just in piecemeal. There's a war going on here, there's a war going on there, there's war there, war there, war there. There's exodus of refugees all over the place. I mean, the war in Syria obviously comes to mind. Millions of people have exited there. And so it's, there's a real darkness over the whole world. I mean, the redemption of Jesus Christ is more needed than ever. And he talks about the shattered dreams because in times past, where there were hopes of people actually working together, countries resolving differences through some kind of a dialogue, which is one of the big things he makes a lot about later on. But there's been a lot of shattered dreams. In other words, false hopes. He doesn't go into what led to the shattered dreams, but we can always tell. Shattered dreams will always come about when sin is present, selfishness, and an unwillingness to enter into genuine relationship with others. And also there's a shattered dreams whenever long-term solutions are, and he doesn't mention this, but it's there in the background. Long-term solutions to human problems are sought without the help of God. That can never happen, you see. You recall the story in the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. People are trying to build a tower to reach heaven, but they're trying to do it on their own backs, by their own ingenuity, not asking God's intervention. And God sees them. They're trying to reach heaven. And in fact, God has made us to want to reach heaven. He's put that very desire in our hearts. However, he wants us to ask for his help to reach heaven. And when he sees human beings through pride trying to solve their problems without his help, then God says, let us go and confuse them. So a lot of human projects, even well-intentioned, don't result in anything because they've either rejected God or rejected Christ, rejected some aspect of the truth. In other words, they're not a true solution. And these are what lead them to the shattered dreams and the dark clouds over a closed world. Notice that he says a closed world, a world that has become more interested in its own countries, in their own people, and within that, not even all the people of a country, even our own, that is a beautiful country, but there's the elites who are all interested in their own issues, and then there's the middle class and the poor who are somewhere in between degrees of being neglected. Paragraph 13, a loss of historical consciousness. What does he mean by this? He means human memory is short. People forget. They forget what harm has been done in recent decades, the loss of life, the killing at all levels. And if we lose the fact that there's been 2 world wars within a century and countless other wars that we could make a great list of, the moment we lose that historical consciousness, then history stands to be repeated again, because there's been no learning from it. But it's precisely the learning from history, particularly the painful lessons, the hardships, that enables us then to move forward. One of the big things amongst the Jewish people is that every generation had to pass on to the succeeding one the story of what God had done for them, particularly the story of the Exodus, that God showed himself to be our Father, our protector, by mighty works. He judged the gods of Egypt and so forth. So why was this so important? Because of that historical consciousness. So we remember our story. Well, Pope Francis, in a sense, is saying that we need to remember the world story, what's going on. Otherwise, we find ourselves victims for all sorts of trouble and dark clouds and shattered dreams. Paragraph 15, he says there is lacking a plan that actually looks after everybody. There are lots of plans when it comes to, and in the letter he spends a lot of time talking about economics and politics. And you be the judge of how successful he will be, and time will certainly tell. But he's very idealistic. I mean, he doesn't stop, and he challenges everyone to look at what needs to be done. But we find a lot of plans, even in our own country, a lot of plans to help this, to help that, but there's no actual comprehensive plan that will look after the needs of everybody. Clearly, because everyone's needs are a bit different, but he's saying that some people are positively overlooked in a lot of the economic plans. He says we live in a throwaway culture that's insufficiently universal human rights. Now, what do we mean by this, or what does he mean by this? You might recall George Orwell's letter, or book rather. It's an allegory called Animal Farm. I remember studying it at school, and it's really a caricature of the Nazis in World War II, and the Russians, and particularly the Russians though, the communism, Stalin, and the totalitarian governments. And one really big line in that book, there are several, is we're all equal, but some are more equal than others. And it's very telling. And that's the plan of an insufficiently universal human rights. We say, everybody has a right for an education. Everybody has a right to work. Everybody has a right to free speech. Everybody has a right to worship according to his or her beliefs. But the moment your rights touch mine, your rights don't count anymore. So, if they're truly universal human rights, then somehow they must be able to be met without conflicting with one another. And later on in the letter, he also touches on this. So he's really putting out the ideals there, okay? In terms of the practicality, I think the politicians and the economists, Catholic politicians and Catholic economists and those of goodwill have to put them into practice. But he's putting out the ideals. So it goes on then, paragraph 26. The first victim of every war is human families' innate vocation to fraternity. Because every war is between 2 or more groups. And the moment that happens, well, I'm fighting, my group is fighting another group. And it means that unity, that we're actually part of a larger family, the human family, has been lost. And that's his point. The the human family's innate vocation to fraternity, that we're actually connected one with another. What he's also saying is that although wars may have, and he talks about the thing of just war and how that teaching can be looked at from now on, but he's saying that there's actually something more in common with our enemies than there are differences. Even when we look at ourselves in our own lives, people that we disagree with and so forth, we actually have more in common with them, our common humanity, our same needs. We need to be loved, we need to be protected, we need food and drink and shelter and so forth, rather than things that divide us. And yet somehow the divisions seem to win out, which is the perennial problem of sin. And ultimately this can only be healed by God, and that's why he sent his son. The paragraph 29, he deals with globalization. Now, he says, what's globalization? He says globalization without a shared roadmap. So a distinction is important here. Globalization and globalism. Globalization refers to that tendency that now countries are no longer independent of one another. That because of the means of technology, satellites, computers, phones, you name it, Zoom, because of all these things have actually made us come closer. I mean, who would have thought 50 years ago that we could be talking and seeing people in two states at the same time and they see us? Can you see us? You can see us. Yep, that's right. So who would have thought of that? That messages can be sent, and this is because a message is going through, bouncing off some satellite, and because of the speed of light, thank God, which is very, very, very fast, it's going back there, and it's like in the same time zone. And who would have thought of all that? But globalization is that tendency on all sorts of levels, technology, economics, and so forth, to be mindful, and inescapably so, of all the other countries in the world. So that's globalization, and then trade that goes as part of that. People travel much, much more than they ever have. Globalism, on the other hand, is not a good thing at all. Globalism is referring to that there's just a one world, and it's like a one world government. And then individual countries lose their identity. Peoples lose their culture. They lose their traditions and so forth, because everything is all about the world. So that's an important distinction. Globalization is happening, and it's actually a good thing because it's being mindful of what is happening across the seas, different countries. But globalism has a tendency then to want to extinguish or snuff out the individuality of a country in service of the overall good, the world view. We have a little example of this in the European Union. This is a little aside, but I think it's important for us to see it as a parallel. The European Union was a project that was developed in the 50s after the Second World War. And the idea was to unite all the countries of Europe so that economically they could be a significant power to challenge the other big economy at the time, which was, and still is, the United States. And why is the United States so influential? Because there's 50 states with their economies united and working as one. But what has happened in the European Union since they joined together? There's a European Union government. And there's expectations. Yes, we will help you with finances. We will give you finances to build up your roads, your infrastructure, and so forth. And so, I don't know how many countries there are in the European Union, about 25 or more maybe. But that will come at a cost. You need to now pass laws that are more permissive of abortion, same-sex marriage, such and such. See, so we'll help you, but we're expecting you to give me back in other ways. Now, what that's doing to the country, yes, it's helping the infrastructure, but in fact, the country is losing some of its identity, some of its soul, particularly religious countries who have a clear position, as we do, against abortion, against same-sex marriage, and so forth. So that's the tendency to globalism. That's just happening within the European Union. So the Pope is not saying that is what should happen, but globalization is something inevitable because of the means of communication. Paragraph 32, he laments again that COVID-19 momentarily revived the sense of the global unity, because we all realize that we're all in this same mess together. A little disease and just spreads, and how quickly in a few hours effectively it's gone through, because of planes and so forth, in several different countries. But for a moment, but again, it's so short-sighted. The moment different countries start to develop a vaccine, well, okay, who's going to have the vaccine first, Who are the really special people? And that is a question. Hang on, I thought we were all talked about universal human rights. But immediately, we're equal, but some are more equal than others. You see the principle coming in? Yeah? Even with, let's say, for example, with vaccines, the decision has to be made as a practical thing. Okay, who gets it first? Does everyone have to have it? Can people refuse to take it? Are we going to impose it on everybody? All those sorts of questions start to surface again. Paragraphs 37 to 41, then he goes on and talks about absence of human dignity on the borders. That obviously he's thinking very much about the limitations of refugees coming in to other countries, and he's saying how easy it is to deprive refugees of their dignity. And we have in our own country, what do they call them? Not refuge centres, detention centres. People coming in boats and internationally and so forth, while they're being processed. Well, sometimes they're waiting there for 2 years or more, which is a very unfortunate and hard situation to stomach. And some people who are more of a heart than others really feel for this, and the Pope is certainly one of these people. But he's saying we've got to be careful that although, yes, there are processing that needs to be done, policies have to be put in place, countries have to think about the resources that they put aside to taking refugees and people at borders. What we cannot lose sight of is that there is in fact everybody has a human dignity, regardless of where they're from. In 42, he says that despite the illusion of communication, digital technology and so forth, people are actually more isolated than ever. We can text one another, call one another, send emails, send instant messenger, you can Instagram, you can Facebook or whatever, and yet, and I kid you not, I've been having conversations, particularly the younger generation are more guilty of this than the older ones, but I'm talking to the person, I'm actually in their physical presence, and they're texting somebody else while they're talking to us. Put that down. You're talking to me. I'm the real relationship going on here, not you with whoever you're talking to, And they even do it like they're cutting lawns or doing other things, They've got their phone with them, as if I can't be apart from my phone, which is a real tragedy, because then the moment they're away from the means of communication, they feel completely empty. And exactly, you took the words out of my mouth. But so communication, the Pope is lamenting that although it has the appearance of keeping us all united, in fact it hasn't done that, because to do that requires something much deeper. Paragraph 47, true wisdom demands an encounter with reality, it says. So, which is very important, and I'm glad he just says that. It's an encounter with reality, because wisdom is not information. Wisdom is not knowledge. Universities are full of information. The internet is full of information. Some good, some bad, but that doesn't lead to wisdom, and not even to knowledge. Understanding how the information applies to the particular situation is what leads to knowledge, but then wisdom is actually a virtue that knows how to apply this knowledge to things in relation to their ultimate end. And so, in order to have wisdom, we require an encounter with reality, which is not so easy as it sounds. Paragraph 50. The path to truth, he says, is always through dialogue, through encounter, and not just facts. What happens in the dialogue? Dialogue, you break it up. It's two words, Greek words, dia, logos. It means, and logos means word. Dia means, with the genitive, it means through the word. So it's through the word to get to somewhere else. But it's precisely through the spoken word. So as we speak words with sincerity, with honesty, we actually begin to encounter the other person. And this is where Pope Francis has really got a lot of genius. And St. John Paul II, in his letter to families back in 94, 2nd of February, he says that love is a sincere gift of self. A sincere gift of self. Well, in genuine dialogue, that's what's going on. We're loving someone, and there's a gift of ourselves to the other person. And we say something, and then they respond. And they may not understand what we have said, and so we put it in a different way. And then they will have a question about it. But when you say that, aren't you really saying this and this? Oh, actually, I didn't think about that. I thought I was actually trying to say such and such. So as the conversation goes on and the sincerity is genuine on both sides, what begins to happen is we actually encounter the other person, and then that leads to a deeper experience of reality, which then leads to truth and to wisdom. The moment that the encounter is not genuine, is not sincere, well, obviously, we're not encountering reality. We're encountering a mask. And, amongst politicians, this is often the case. Countries put up a facade amongst themselves. They will go to gatherings of leaders. Yes, nice to meet you. We've all got our masks on, Yeah, I've got my mask too, But somehow this is all going to be very genuine. But it's all an appearance. If there isn't the genuine encounter there, even as two politicians, both tasked with a particular objective, then we need to get somewhere here, but it's got to be a sincerity. And it's not as easy as you think, because we actually need to work at it, because there are prejudices sometimes. There's a history that's there, and that makes us think about it. Yeah, but you ordered your military to attack such and such or whatever, and all sorts of things, and they're factual and they're true things. Fast forward to paragraph 65, he again laments the indifference in the face of suffering. And again, this is a profound Christian teaching. If there's anything that we see in the example of Christ, it's that he couldn't see human suffering. He couldn't bear to see it without wanting to do something about it. We see it reflected in the words of Saint Mary MacKillop, our local saint, that never see a need, she says, without doing something about it. And sometimes we cannot actually do something physical, but we can pray for that person. How many times we drive past, and I'm speaking of myself here, on the freeway, on the road, someone's broken down. I can't do anything about it. I'm not a mechanic. I can't, and I know they're not in absolute trouble or whatever they need, and usually someone has stopped with them. I'll say a prayer. Or I'll see an ambulance racing past. I think, you know what? There might be somebody dying inside. I'll actually do a conditional absolution, Maybe someone's gone to the Lord precisely at that moment. So we do what we can, but indifference is really the opposite of love. It's seeing human suffering, seeing a need, and then having the reaction, I don't care. It's not my responsibility. That's a horrible thing. But we've all seen it, right? We've all seen it around. Paragraph 75, he talks about then the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I like how he does it. He takes it apart, and the role of the Good Samaritan, the Levites, the priest, even the robbers get a mention. And he says the robbers often find their allies. And what he's referring to in this, it's actually quite funny, but very, very true, is that there are often many who lament the plight of the poor in the world. They'll say, oh yeah, it's really bad. So many families are taken advantage of, fathers are separated from their wives and children because they've got to go to work. They're given poor money, poor wages, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, the people who often say these things are like the robbers. They're actually benefiting from the same corruption of the system that they are also part of. And unfortunately, all too often we see, although there are good politicians around, thank God, there are also bad politicians, and it seems many of them, who on the one hand will pay lip service to the sadness that we see of the Good Samaritan or the person who's being injured, but behind the scenes they are actually benefiting it. Even on the whole thing, for instance, of the climate change debate, and wherever you are on that side of the debate, but you'll have people who are saying, we need to reduce emissions and so forth, but then on the other hand, they're flying around in jets and all over the world and you think, hang on a minute, do you really believe what you're saying or not? Or their actions are undoing what their words are saying. So really, they're people who fall into that category of the robbers who are attacking the innocent traveller and who are always finding allies to exploit their situation, those kinds of situations. Paragraph 98, he says, one of the ways in which we reach out to our neighbours is by including the disabled in ecclesial communities. Why is this such a good point? Because the disabled are different from us. Now, we're actually different from each other, but the differences are more subtle. But if I have one eye, or I am blind, if I am lacking a foot, so I come to church and I've got a plastic leg and a real leg, or I'm missing an arm, or I can't talk, so I have to talk with one of those breathing apparatuses, and I talk like this, and my voice goes, that you've come across, you've met people like that. I'm not making fun of them, but that's how the mechanism works. When we are confronted by people who are with disabilities, they are different to us. And it makes us realize that although I may have difficulties in my own life, there's always someone who has even more. So he says by involving or including, going out of our way to include the disabled amongst ecclesial communities is a way of overcoming our own walls. One of the walls that are often present are the walls of our unconscious prejudices. And so by putting ourselves at the periphery, he loves to use this expression, going out to the periphery means going out of our comfort zones. It means then we are actually at the point of being able to experience those limits of our prejudices, that I realize my heart actually doesn't love as much as it thought it did. And by encountering someone at the periphery, I actually come to realize that there's goodness there, and they can help me, and I can help them. So then he moves on, paragraph 116, that solidarity is the way forward. Solidarity is received a lot of positive feedback and publicity during the time under the movement Solidarność, the Polish movement, in the time leading up to the collapse of communism in the former USSR, and with Lech Walesa, and the Pope was John Paul II at the time, was being from Poland, really supported this movement. But solidarity means sticking together for a common cause with those who are poor, with those who are underprivileged. The gospel is always biased towards the underdog. And this is one of those positive Australian things that in Australia we often tend to want to favour the underdog, which is something really that's actually very, very Christian. Not that necessarily everybody does it, but that's where we go, or what we should be doing as Christians. Then at 120, he actually says something that's quite provocative. He says about the ownership to private property. Now, I don't think anyone here would deny that people have a right to own private property. People often work hard to buy their own piece of land. But he mentions that the right to ownership of private property is not an absolute right. It's not like an inalienable human right. For example, the right to work, the right to be able to raise your children as you like, the right to have an education, the right to worship. And he's aiming this at those who own large amounts of property and who employ people to work on their property and then to exploit these people, paying them poor salaries and that kind of thing. So he's saying really that's an abuse of the property that you own. And it would be better if people actually owned a small portion, and but then they would take care of it and use it for the common good. So while ownership of private property is fine, and the church has always supported this, nevertheless it must be borne in mind that we're also part of the common good, which is bigger than ourselves. In 126, he says something I thought was very shocking, I don't know, very idealistic and very ambitious. Very ambitious. He says, we need an ethics of international relations. Any reaction there? Yeah, I think good luck to you. Good luck to you, working out an ethics of, you convince the international community to actually act ethically. Yeah, it's nice, but it's very utopian, But in fact, they need to act ethically. They need to be held accountable. And the reason they often get away with things is because they're not, there's nobody kicking up. There's nobody resisting and pushing against their way of behaving. It's might is right. It's David against Goliath. But David doesn't even have a slingshot, in this case, and the poor often are left alone. So we need an ethics of international relations. He doesn't talk about how this is to be developed, but actually gives a few hints later on, but he just mentions it at this point. 127, we need a new way of thinking, an alternative way, because obviously the way we've been going up till now is just breeding more of the same. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and there's no real change. In paragraph 130, he lists a whole lot of helpful assistance that can be given to refugees. I'm actually going to read that out because, again, I thought it was very, very, very ambitious, and even if it's not, it can't be fully done, it's certainly very worthwhile to think about. And he says, as examples we may cite, I'll read the whole paragraph, it's not that long. This implies taking certain indispensable steps, especially in response to those who are fleeing grave humanitarian crises. As examples we may cite increasing and simplifying the granting of visas. He's not saying any of these are easy, okay? But it's ambitious. Simplifying the granting of visas, adopting programs of individual and community sponsorship, opening humanitarian corridors for the most vulnerable refugees, providing suitable and dignified housing, guaranteeing personal security and access to basic services, ensuring adequate consular assistance and the right to retain personal identity documents. See, people are stripped of their documents, they're very vulnerable. I don't know who you are, you're a spy, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's easy for me to, as a government, to take advantage of you then, and it happens. Ensuring equitable access to the justice system, the possibility of opening bank accounts, and the guarantee of the minimum needed to survive. Freedom of movement and the possibility of employment, protecting minors and ensuring their regular access to education, providing for programs of temporary guardianship or shelter, guaranteeing religious freedom, promoting integration into society, supporting the reuniting of families, and preparing local communities for the process of integration. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff. I mean, all good things, but again, good luck to you getting that implemented. But it's got to be put out there, because these are the things that basically impact on so many families. And you know, while most of us would feel very helpless in actually being able to do anything practical in that regard, but it gives us things to pray for. It helps us to realize, you know what, I live in a country where I can have all these things, but there are many others who don't. I want to pray for them. Lord, grant them to come in contact with people of goodwill, people of faith, people who can help them and who want to reach out, who don't want to turn an indifferent face to their own suffering. Good. The paragraph 131, treating refugees, he says, as citizens in countries. Now, this is a contentious issue because citizenship is not granted to everybody in the country. True? It isn't. Not everybody in a country. If you're born in that country, you get automatic citizenship, but I had to wait some years before I could become a citizen of this country. And it was a real rite of passage. This country is now my home. I'm going to be committed to it. It'll be committed to me. I will have rights and privileges because of my citizenship. So, I mean, he puts it in inverted commas because he doesn't mean that we actually should be granting citizenship to every refugee. But he's saying that the basic fundamentals of citizenship need to be safeguarded, because the basic fundamentals are not about being Australian or being an American or being from Thailand or Malaysia or China or Vietnam. It's not about that. It's actually about being human. It's human. It's human dignity. So yes, necessarily countries have to put limitations in place. They have to filter whether I'm letting in a person of goodwill, genuine, or I'm letting in a terrorist. Countries have to place those filters or put those filters in place, but a person should be treated with dignity. And that's not so easy. Again, it's easier to say than to do, particularly if a country has been attacked, has been a victim of whatever, terrorism and all that sort of thing. Then he says something, this is a bombshell, 132. We need a global governance in relation to migrants. That's a very bold statement to make, because global governance, well, it sounds very noble and ideal, but we're always dealing with flawed human beings. And the same thing about, for instance, that we see in the European Union, we see infighting and indecision and partiality in the government there across the different countries of Europe. You know, people can't just come and go as they please. Look how long it's been now for Britain to try and exit the Brexit, you know, the European Union. Okay, so it was easy enough to come in, but to leave, there's going to be costs now. And, you know, fair enough, I understand that there's trade-offs that go on here, but can you imagine increasing a global government to overlook refugees across the world, that sooner or later this would be abused. So while it's a good idea in a utopian world, in a very honest world, but you need to have a mechanism in place to make sure that this global government, if it's going to take place, that it needs to be regulated and controlled. And who's going to do that controlling? Because global governments, in fact, the tendency is always to absorb more and more authority, not to give it away. And in the experience of last century with totalitarian regimes, whether we're looking at the USSR, we're looking at China, we're looking at South America, there's a whole lot of that tendency to want to absorb absolute authority is a very dangerous precedent. You might be familiar with the old statement, I think it was Lord Acton may have said it first. He says, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now Jesus Christ has absolute power, but it doesn't corrupt him because he has emptied himself of all, and he is the Son of God. So it would take a very virtuous person to be entrusted with high authority. And I mean, just the personal reflection in this pandemic, the way different political leaders have handled the governance of the pandemic. I've just seen a tendency among some of them to want to be absolutist about the way it is. And I've got a bit of a theory that a person who is in authority, who is insecure, is more likely to abuse authority rather than somebody who is very secure and emotionally mature. We look at people, to choose some of the worst cases, people like Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini. We see it's amazing how insecure these men were. They're very afraid, paranoid. We pick a guy from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, we've all heard recently, Herod the Great. News of a new king. Wise men, where is he? No, you go and find out all about him, because I too want to go and worship the little infant king of the Jews. You see, it's that threat of. So that's a danger. It's a nice ideal to have the global governments in relation to migrants, but again, keeping it honest is a very big challenge. East and West 136 can help each other, and he says this is where a lot of suspicions have been broken with East and West, particularly on religious lines. Islam and Christianity can help each other, and he talks about some of the ways in which that can be done. Paragraph 141, he talks about and warns against avoiding a narrow nationalism. Now, I'm not sure what he means by nationalism, but what I think he means is patriotism. The normal word we would use in English is patriotism is good, nationalism is bad. When I was in Germany doing a bit of German back a few years ago, I went to visit Dachau one weekend, and I got a private tour. I was very fortunate and privileged. And the guy who was giving us a private tour there, of course it's nothing like what it was during wartime. It was the first concentration camp where a lot of the murdering was being done, and the priests were actually held in that concentration camp. A lot of them were killed there, and the drugs were developed. And I said to the guy, what do you think leads a country to eventually head down the trajectory, down the path of committing such atrocities? It was just horrible things, and it stayed with me, all that day and for the several days afterwards. He said, nationalism. When a country becomes nationalistic, then it thinks, because nationalism thinks that it is better than another country. Whereas patriotism is a genuine loyalty and love for your country. we are all obliged to do that, you know. We should love Australia because we're living in Australia. But the moment we start to think Australia is the best country in the world, then we're in dangerous ground. And I'm glad I've had a chance in my years as a priest to live and work as a priest in 4 different countries. Because in each country I've realized, yeah, the United States does some things better than in Australia. But Australia does certain things better than the United States. Italy has a wonderful attitude about life and fun and enjoying your food and relaxing, but they can learn more about work and working hard and pulling your own weight. Malta, the same thing. Family, village life and so forth, strong in the faith, but can be sometimes small-minded, you know. So it made me think there's no perfect country in the world. So it should make our hearts long for the perfect country, which is heaven, right? That's the perfect country. But nationalism starts to think of one's country as being better than another. And so what I think he means by narrow nationalism is, yes, be proud of your country, but don't think your country is the only one that has good things about it. Other countries who may not be as great as yours, but there's goodness there. So I think it's a very valid point that he makes, but the definition of nationalism is very clear. We need to have a proper local flavour, 143, paragraph 143, a proper local flavour. What does that mean? To understand what I've just said, that you need to have a proper patriotism, a love for one's country that takes it into consideration and thinks, yep, it's good, it's lovely, but let's not overstate things. There's always a tendency amongst human beings, many human beings, to want to overplay your hand. We always want to put our best foot forward. If you're going for a job interview, well, you're going to come dressed well, you'll speak properly, you'll pay attention, you'll prepare as much as you can. Why? Because you want to get the job. And that's putting your best foot forward. But the moment we forget that I have a weak side, I have darkness, I have sin, I have selfishness, then I'm living in a delusional world. And having a proper local flavour means I understand my strengths, but I also understand my weaknesses in terms of my community, my society. 149, having a proper universal horizon. Again, we need to be properly open. Some people can, some countries, some societies cannot see the horizon open to anything much bigger than themselves. Without wanting to criticize the US too much, when I was in the US, I was there for 4 years. It was astonishing. I didn't see much international news when I was there. Now, okay, it's a country of 320, probably now 340 million people. There's so much happening just across the country. It's enough to fill up more than half an hour or an hour of news. But I thought to myself, okay, Australia is much smaller, but we genuinely hear about other parts of the world, which is good. Part of that is because we're small, so there's only so much happens in our own local boundaries, but it's about having a universal horizon. And then I asked some of the priests that I was living with, and they said, well, actually, yeah, we used to have a policy of isolation here. We used to call it isolationism, where various presidents had, in fact, said, we are interested in our own country, we don't have to be involved with others, we can be self-sufficient. That is not a good thing, because it forgets this fraternity amongst others. I'll just finish this one, and then we can maybe have a little break, and then we'll be fine with the others. Sorry, let me just see where that's up to. So the final thing is, before we break up for a break, is paragraph 153, where he says he encourages different people, particularly poorer countries, to stay together in their local regions. And I'm thinking he has a lot of countries here in South America which can easily become victims for giant companies around the world to exploit them of their own particular resources, be they natural resources, human resources, for cheap labour and that sort of thing. And he's advising poorer countries to join together. So this is really economics, but under the principle of solidarity, to join together so that as a bloc they have much more bargaining power against big companies who want to take advantage of them. And he says, whereas we cannot live in a world now that, as we once did, where globalization is not a reality. It is a reality, and we either stick together and we survive, with the smaller country in particular, or we think we can stand alone and we find out that we suffer a lot unnecessarily, economically, politically, and in certain ways humanly. So that's paragraph 53. We can stop there. That's the end of chapter 4, and then leave the chapters 5 to 8 for afterwards. Any quick questions? Even from people watching through Zoom, through Brisbane and Melbourne. Yeah. Any questions? Just raise your hand. You might need to come closer to the microphone though, so I can hear you. I can't see if anyone's putting their hands up at the top. No?
No
Okay.
question?
If that's the case, then we'll have a break and we'll reconvene at 2:30 p.m.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.